The next thing that the author is going to mention is وَبِاللَّمْسِ وَهُوَ عَلَى أَرْبَعَةِ أَقْسَامٍ إن قصد اللذة ووجدها فعليه الوضوء وإن وجدها ولم يقصدها فعليه الوضوء وإن قصدها ولم يجدها فعليه الوضوء وإن لم يقصد اللذة ولم يجدها فلا وضوء عليه. The next thing that the author is going to mention is touching, and what he's referring to here by touching is touching the opposite sex, whether it is a man touching a woman or whether it is a woman touching a man. And just like sleep, touching bil-lams is separated into 4 different categories. Now, lams is where touching is touching, but technically refers to any type of physical contact between the opposite sex, whether it's touching with the hand, whether it's the body touching body. So he's going to mention 4 types, and so we'll see here. He says وَبِاللَّمْسِ وَهُوَ عَلَى أَرْبَعَةِ أَقْسَامٍ is 4 types. Now, just as a general rule, I'll mention to you, which will make it easier for you to understand. Generally, there's 2 elements to touching, and either that is a person intends to seek pleasure by touching the opposite sex, meaning he seeks it, meaning he intends to touch in order to seek that type of pleasure of coming in contact with the opposite sex, whether that's a handshake, whether it's rubbing bodies, whatever it is. Or the second element is that a person experienced it upon touching. And experiencing doesn't mean lust, because lust is a strong word when it's it would necessitate that the person has some strong inclination. What we referring to here means that a person has any type of inclination to the opposite sex at the time that the person is making that body contact. So as long as one of these elements are present, whether meaning the person sought the desire upon acting, then the wudu will be broken. Or if the other element is found, meaning that a person experienced it upon touching, then that will nullify the wudu as well. So obviously, if a person experienced both of them at the same time, then it's going to nullify wudu. So the general rule is this: as long as one of these 2 elements are found, then the wudu will be broken. And so you will see here that this is displayed in these 4 categories. It says وَبِاللَّمْسِ وَهُوَ أَرْبَعَةُ أَقْسَامٍ. The first one is إِنْ قَصَدَ اللَّذَّةَ وَوَجَدَهَا, that he intended to seek desire and he experienced it. So he was in a crowded place, and for example he intended to go close to somebody so he can have some contact, and so when he did that and he experienced it, فَعَلَيْهِ الْوُضُوء, then it is obligatory for him to make wudu. The second one, إِن قَصَدَ لَذَّةَ وَإِن وَجَدَهَا وَلَمْ يَقْصِدْهَا فَعَلَيْهِ الْوُضُوء. So the second one is he experienced it, but it wasn't his intention. So for example, he was in a crowded place, he was walking by, and somebody young his age, or same thing with the woman, and he touched her by example, or she touched his hand, he touched her hand, or somehow any type of collision, however, colliding of the 2 bodies or contact of the 2 bodies, however it may be, whatever the scenario may be. In the second case, he experienced it, but he didn't necessarily seek it. So, as I mentioned to you, he's going to say, فَعَلَيْهِ الْوُضُوء, it's obligatory for him to make wudu. Why? Because one of the 2 necessary elements that I mentioned are present, and that's the in wajadaha, that he found it, or that he experienced it. Third one, وَإِن قَصَدَهَا وَلَمْ يَجِدْهَا فَعَلَيْهِ الْوُضُوء, and if he intended it, but he didn't experience it, but that was his reason for putting his hand out, that was his reason for walking down that narrow place, that's what he intended, then his wudu will be nullified. Why? Because the qasd, the intention, is there. So that's one of the 2 elements that I mentioned. Now the fourth one that he's going to mention is وَإِن لَمْ يَقْصِدَ اللَّذَّةَ, if he did not intend or seek desire, وَلَمْ يَجِدْهَا, and he didn't experience it, فَلَا وُضُوءَ عَلَيْهِ, there's no wudu that's obligatory on him. Why? Because both of the elements that necessitate wudu, none of them are present. He didn't seek it, nor did he find it. So that's the rule of touching. Now, another thing that the ulama touching, that the person touched and the one touching takes the same ruling. So if a person were to touch the opposite sex, for example, a man was to touch a woman, and the woman were to find some type of pleasure in it, then that same thing, the same thing would apply. Right? Why? Because the person touched and the one touching, the rule is the same. Another rule here is that this touching will only apply, or the desire that it's experienced will only apply if he experiences at the time of touching. So if he touches and he doesn't experience at the time that he's touching, meaning some moments later it dawns upon him that she was such and such, or it dawns upon her that he was such and such, or has some type of inclination somewhere down the line, not at the time of touching, then that will not nullify the wudu. It must be at the same time. Another rule that applies here is that will apply to any type of touching, whether the person is touching the hair, even just a strand of the hair, then anything that's considered part of the body, then if desire is there, then they experience it or they sought it, then that would nullify the wudu. So if a person is with his spouse, for example, and then they're touching each other, and it's not there's no there's sexual inclination, but there's actually no sexual activity, that will still nullify the wudu. Why? The question is, why is it nullify wudu? Because we said in asbab, we call them asbab because we call them indirect causes, because in most cases this is a cause for madhi to come up, because where there's sexual activity from the opposite sex with no actual intercourse, then it's a cause for madhi to come out in most cases, and so it nullifies wudu. Now, the last thing that the author is going to mention are things that you might assume might nullify wudu, but they actually don't. And the reason why we might assume that is because in some hadith, these things that he's going to mention come as things that nullify wudu, but according to our madhab, we either don't see that those hadith are authentic or applicable for application for one reason or another, or we find that the hadith that oppose it are stronger, or another reason for mentioning it is to clarify that it's not our madhab because it is the madhab of some other school. So the first one that he mentions is وَلَا يَنْتَقِدُ الْوُضُوء بِمَسِّ الدُّبُرٍ. Wudu is not nullified by touching the anus. Dubur, that's what it refers to. It doesn't touching about the rear cheeks. It's actually talking about touching the anus. And from what I was taught, that is the position of Imam Shafi. So he's mentioning it here, rahimahullah. They're mentioning it here because that's not our madhab. Wala al-unthayin, and nor is touching the testicles considered, doesn't nullify the salah either. The next one that he mentions, wala bimassi farji saghiratin, and not by the touching of the genital organ of a small girl. Now, what does this mean? It means that a male who touches, for example, a saghir, a small girl, means a girl who has not reached the age of puberty. So, for example, the age of puberty, or hasn't come close to puberty. For example, the determining factor, meaning she hasn't reached the age to where she would be inclined towards, meaning she doesn't possess any attributes of inclination, and that obviously would go back to urf. So, for example, the girl who's maybe 12 years old, she hasn't got her menstruation, she's age of 12, and so she's pretty much close to bulugh, so we'd rule her out because she would be somebody to whom a person may be inclined towards. And we're talking about a little girl, for example, 5 years old or 6 years old, in a case where let's say, are changing the diaper of a little girl, so you're cleaning, then in that case, if a man were to touch, then that would not nullify wudu. Same thing would also apply for a woman who's changing a little boy or something, or whatever the case may be, then that wouldn't nullify wudu either. However, the scholars do mention under the case that the person is actually not a fasik, a person is not actually one of those, like a sick person, a fasik meaning a sinner, who does take pleasure from touching a young girl or a young boy, may Allah protect us from that, then in that case, that person as wudu would be broken. But the general rule is what I mentioned here, that it doesn't break it. Wala qay'in, and vomiting doesn't nullify wudu, contrary to the Hanafis who say that vomiting in salah nullifies wudu. So if they vomit in salah, then we agree that the prayer will be that a person should come out of his prayer if that vomit has gone in his clothes, because he has to remove the impurity. But according to the Hanafis, the wudu would also be broken, whereas in our method the wudu is not broken. So there he's clarifying that by letting us know that that's not the method of the Malikiyah. Wala bi akli lahmi jazurin, and neither the eating of the meat of eating camel meat, as it comes in Sahih Hadith about the Prophet ﷺ making wudu from camel meat, but the other hadith in the compilations and the Sahabas themselves had made clear that this hadith no longer applies, meaning that the obligation to make wudu from eating camel meat is mansukh. It's been abrogated by other sound hadith, because the last actions of the Prophet ﷺ, that he would eat meat and he would eat camel meat, and he would pray without making wudu. However, some of the ulama said that it's still mustahab to wash the mouth. Right? Wash the mouth, because camel meat has lots of fat on it, so it's recommended to wash the mouth. Wala hijamatin wala fastin, and cupping and bloodletting also doesn't nullify the wudu. And the reason why they're mentioning that, because there is a hadith that comes about that the person who cups, then his wudu will be nullified. But according to the Malikiyah, we don't make amal on that hadith for other reasons. So we're mentioning this as a clarification that we don't make amal on this hadith for one reason or another, and it will not nullify wudu. So the word hijama means actually the blood cupping, and fast is a little different. Fast is when you actually just put lines in a person's skin, little slit lines, and you don't actually pull out the blood, you just bloodletting. That's why I translate as blooding, whereas hijama is actually you're going to suck it out of the wound, whereas fasting is where you just put 1 line, 2 line, 3 line, 4 line, or a little bit of lines in the area of the body, and you just let some of the blood out. Wala bi qahqahatin fi salatin, and neither is laughing nullify the prayer. That is also according to the Hanafis, that laughing nullifies laughing in prayer nullifies wudu. So keep in mind, he says wala bi qahqahatin fi salatin. It doesn't mean that laughing in the prayer, meaning that laughing in the prayer doesn't nullify the salah. We're in the bab of wudu, so pay attention. What he means by that laughing in the salah doesn't nullify wudu is as opposed to the Hanafis, who are of the view that laughing in prayer nullifies the wudu. But we both agree that laughing in the prayer obviously will nullify it, because it's like speaking intentionally, so that will nullify the wudu. But it won't. It will nullify the prayer, but doesn't nullify the wudu. But for the Hanafis, it does, and for us it doesn't. So he's making that point that for the Malikis it doesn't. Wala bimasi imra'atin farjaha. Also, for a woman touching her private part, according to the Malikiyah, we say that it doesn't, because the hadith that mentioned making wudu mentioned that إِذَا مَسَّ ذَكَرَهُ فَلْيَتَوَضَّأ أو كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The hadith of the Prophet mentions that a person who touches his dhakar actually refers to the penis of a male, then he should make wudu. So the fact that it mentions dhakar, penis, rules out testicles, as we mentioned before, which is one of the reasons why we don't consider it something that nullifies wudu, and it rules out the anus of a male or female, and it rules out the genital organ of a female, because the word dhakar is something that's specific to a female, not of a man. So there are difference of opinions in this mas'ala, as you're going to see in this matter of fiqh. But what he mentions here, وَلَا بِمَسِ إِمْرَأَةٍ فَرْجَهَا, that's according to the mu'tamad, that it will not nullify her prayer. Now he says وَقِيلَ, qila here means that there is a weak opinion. In al-tafat فَعَلَيْهَا الْوُدُوء وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ. But al-tafat here means if she were to put her finger on the inside of her genital organ, then her wudu would be broken. So they agree that touching the outside of it doesn't break wudu. But however, they disagree on whether if she puts it on the inside will it nullify wudu. According to the author here, he uses qila, which is giving the impression that it's a weak opinion. That is the opinion that's mentioned in some of the Shurahat of Muqtasar Khalil and Sharh Saghir and so on and so forth, that the sound opinion is that it will not nullify wudu. However, when we turn to Ibn Ashir, many of the Maghribi scholars, Ibn Ashir, which was a Maghribi, rahimahullah, they're of the view that they were of the view that if she sticks her finger inside her genital organ, then her wudu will be nullified. But the mashhur opinion is that it will not be nullified, but also the opinion that it will be nullified is also strong, which is why Ibn Ashir mentioned. But according to the later scholars, it's not the mashhur. And the reason why they differed is because if she touches the outside, if she touches the inside, then in most cases there's desire. Just like if a person were to masturbate, then he would seek desire. Likewise, if a woman were to put her finger on the inside, then in most cases there would be some sexual desire. So that's where the ikhtilaf takes place. Then the author says, Wallahu a'lam, consigning all knowledge and truth to Allah Azza wa Jal by saying, and Allah knows best, which is generally from the adab of the scholars say Allahu a'lam bis sawab, meaning Allah knows what is most correct. So that is the lesson that we are dealing with today in regards to the things that nullify wudu. And so we'll stop there. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.